The forest was darker than I remembered. Thick shadows pooled between the trees, and my flashlight barely pierced through the gloom. I was leading a small search and rescue team, combing the dense wilderness for a missing hiker named Eric. Reports said he'd been out here for 3 days. The chances of finding him alive were slim, but we pressed on. The forest was too silent, and the usual chirps of birds or rustling of leaves were absent. I told myself it was just my imagination. Then, we found him. Eric stumbled out of the undergrowth, clothes torn, face pale as ash. His breathing was ragged, and his eyes were wide with terror. When he saw me, he froze. His gaze locked onto mine, and he took a shaky step back. "No," he whispered. "No, it can't be you." I raised my hands to calm him. "Eric, it's okay. We're here to help you." He shook his head violently. "You don't understand. I was following someone who looked just like you. They led me off the trail." My stomach dropped. The rest of my team exchanged uneasy glances. I wanted to tell Eric he was imagining things, that fear and hunger had played tricks on his mind. But then one of my teammates called out. "Hey, check this out," she said, pointing to the ground. The flashlight beam lit up a trail of footprints in the dirt. They were fresh, and they were a perfect match for the boots I was wearing. The search and rescue team had set up a base camp at the edge of the forest. A small fire flickered in the center, casting faint orange light on the tense faces of my teammates. The trees loomed around us, their twisted branches like skeletal arms reaching for the sky. The forest felt alive, watching, waiting. Every creak and snap of a twig made me flinch. Eric sat on a log near the fire, wrapped in a blanket. He wouldn't look at me. His hands trembled as he sipped from a mug of warm tea. I wanted to press him for answers, but his fear was raw and real. I needed to tread carefully. "Eric," I said softly, sitting down across from him, "can you tell me what happened? Start from the beginning." He hesitated, glancing nervously at the shadows beyond the firelight. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was hiking the main trail when I saw someone up ahead. I called out, but they didn't respond. They just kept walking. I thought they might be hurt or lost, so I followed them. That's when I noticed they looked exactly like you." I frowned. "Are you sure? It could have been someone with a similar jacket or build." He shook his head. "Number, it was you. Same face, same voice. They even called my name, but when I got close, they smiled at me. It wasn't a normal smile, it was wrong. And their eyes, they were empty, just black pits." The fire crackled, filling the silence. My teammates looked uneasy, shifting in their seats. I tried to stay calm, but my hands clenched into fists. "What happened next?" I asked. "They led me off the trail deeper into the forest. I don't know why I followed them. It was like I couldn't stop myself. Then they disappeared, and I got lost. I thought I was going to die out there." That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my tent, staring at the fabric ceiling, listening to the forest. Eric's story kept replaying in my head. Could he have seen a real person? Or was it a hallucination? And the footprints, that was the part I couldn't explain. They matched mine perfectly, right down to the tread pattern. I'd checked. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint sounds that could have been voices. I sat up, heart pounding. Was someone out there? I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. The cold night air hit me as I stepped outside. The camp was quiet. My teammates were asleep in their tents, and the fire had burned down to glowing embers. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark. My breath hung in the air like mist. Nothing moved, but the uneasy feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. Then I saw it. Just beyond the edge of the camp, a figure stood between the trees. My flashlight illuminated their face, and my blood turned to ice. It was me. They had my face, my clothes, even my expression, but their eyes were empty black voids, just like Eric had described. The figure raised a hand and beckoned me forward. I froze, unable to move. My mind raced. Was this some kind of trick? A dream? The figure stepped closer, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" They didn't answer. Instead, they smiled a twisted, unnatural grin that stretched too wide. Then they spoke, but the voice wasn't mine. It was layered, like a chorus of whispers. "You shouldn't have come here." My legs finally obeyed me, and I turned to run. I tripped over a tent rope and hit the ground hard, the flashlight skidding out of my hand. By the time I scrambled to my feet and looked back, the figure was gone. The forest was silent again, but I could feel something watching me. I woke the others, explaining what I'd seen. Most of them thought I was just spooked, but Eric's face told me he believed every word. "It's them," he said. "They're still here. They're always here." The next morning, we decided to leave. Eric was in no condition to hike, so we carried him on a makeshift stretcher. The forest seemed to close in around us as we walked. The trees were too tall, the shadows too deep. Every so often, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Then we found the second trail of footprints. They ran parallel to ours, as if someone was following us, and they were identical to mine. Panic set in as my teammates started to argue. Some wanted to keep moving, while others thought we should turn back. I stayed silent, my eyes scanning the forest for any sign of the figure. That's when we heard the laughter. It echoed through the trees, high and distorted, like a recording played in reverse. The air grew colder, and a foul smell like rotting meat filled the air. Eric began to scream, pointing ahead. "There!" he shouted. "It's here!" I looked up and saw the figure again, standing in our path. This time, there were more of them. 4, 5, 6, all with my face, all with those black, empty eyes. The figures closed in, surrounding us. My team panicked, shouting and waving their flashlights, but the light didn't seem to bother them. One of the figures reached out, its hand brushing against my arm. It felt cold, like ice, and my skin burned where it touched me. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Eric and pulling him to his feet. We bolted through the forest, branches tearing at our clothes and faces. The figures gave chase, their laughter echoing around us. No matter how fast we ran, they were always just behind us. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath me, and I fell into a ravine. Pain shot through my leg as I landed hard, but I forced myself to stand. Eric was beside me, sobbing and clutching his chest. The figures stood at the edge of the ravine, staring down at us. Then, one by one, they vanished into the shadows. We made it out of the forest just as the sun began to rise. My team was shaken but alive. Eric was taken to the hospital, where he'd eventually recover, though he refused to speak of what happened. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us out. In the days that followed, I noticed strange things. My reflection in the mirror lingered a second too long. My shadow moved when I didn't, and at night, I'd wake to the sound of footsteps outside my window. I thought I'd left the forest behind, but I was wrong. It had left a part of itself in me. The rescue boat rocked in the dirty water as we looked around the flooded neighborhood. What used to be a street was now a muddy river, full of broken things, pieces of roofs, chairs, and a teddy bear missing one eye. The air smelled bad, like old garbage and gas, and every sound made me jump. We had been searching houses all day. The next one was falling apart, with only its roof sticking out of the water. I grabbed my crowbar and shouted, "Is anyone in there?" My voice echoed, but no one answered. I was about to leave when I heard a child crying. I froze, listening hard. It came again, soft and scared, from inside the house. Without thinking, I climbed onto the roof and started tearing off the shingles. The crying got louder as I worked faster, my hands aching from the effort. When I finally broke through, I climbed down into a small, flooded room. My boots splashed into freezing water. It smelled wet and moldy. The room looked like it had been a nursery. There was a crib in the corner, tipped sideways and covered in water stains. Toys floated in the water, a stuffed bunny, a broken doll. But it was the walls that made me stop. The wallpaper had little stars on it, but it was shredded. Long, deep scratches covered the walls, like something had clawed at them. Then, the crying stopped. I spun around, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called. "Is someone here?" No answer. But the water rippled, just a little. The whole neighborhood was underwater, with only the tops of houses sticking out. Some were almost completely gone, broken apart by the force of the flood. The sky above was gray and heavy, like it was pressing down on everything. The air smelled thick and sour, a mix of rotten wood, gasoline, and mud. The house I was in felt worse than the others. It was too quiet. Even the sounds of the water outside seemed far away. The air was damp and cold, and it clung to my skin like a wet sheet. Shadows moved across the walls, but when I turned my head, there was nothing there. Inside the house, everything was broken or floating. Furniture was tipped over, waterlogged books lay in piles, and picture frames were smashed. One frame caught my eye photo of a family. The glass was cracked, and the smiling faces of a man, a woman, and a small child stared back at me. The edges of the photo were stained, and it looked like it had been underwater for days. As I stepped through the water, my boots made soft splashes, but the noise felt wrong, too loud, like it didn't belong here. In the corner of the room, an old clock hung on the wall, but its hands weren't moving. Still, I could hear faint ticking, like it was alive. Deeper inside the house, I heard a soft, steady knocking. It was coming from somewhere below me. It wasn't loud, but it made my skin crawl. I thought about the scratches on the walls upstairs and the crying I had heard. Something about this place felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be here. I called out again. "Is someone here? Do you need help?" Only silence answered me, but as I stood there, I could feel it. The house was watching me. I moved carefully through the house, the water splashing softly with every step. The walls seemed to close in as I went deeper, the air colder with every breath. It wasn't just the cold that made me shiver, there was something in the air, something that felt heavy, like a weight pressing on my chest. I found more signs of the people who had lived here. A tiny shoe floated by my foot, its laces trailing behind. A muddy teddy bear sat slumped against a door, its button eyes staring at nothing. The family must have left in a hurry, or maybe they couldn't leave at all. I kept hearing noises, soft whispers that didn't make sense, and faint splashes, like something was moving through the water behind me. Every time I turned around, there was nothing there. The knocking sound from earlier grew louder, coming from below me now. It had a strange rhythm, like it was trying to say something. My heart raced as I tried to find a way down. I didn't want to go, but I had to. I couldn't stop thinking about the crying I had heard. What if there really was a child trapped here? I found the basement door half open, its edges swollen from the water. The knocking was louder here, almost like a heartbeat. I hesitated, staring into the dark, wet staircase leading down. "Hello?" I called again, my voice trembling. "I am here to help." No one answered, but then, very softly, I heard it again. "Help me." The voice was faint and weak, like it was coming from underwater. I gripped the railing and started down the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, and the water rose higher as I went. By the time I reached the basement, it was almost up to my knees. The room was dark, with only a faint light coming from a small, dirty window near the ceiling. The water rippled gently, and in the middle of the room was a rocking chair, floating slowly back and forth. My stomach tightened as I stepped closer. The water rippled again, harder this time, like something had moved beneath it. I froze, staring at the surface. "Is someone there?" I whispered. The chair tipped over suddenly, splashing into the water. At the same time, I felt something brush against my leg. I gasped and stumbled back, nearly falling. The water grew still again, but I couldn't stop shaking. Then the voice came again, louder now. "Help me." I turned toward the sound and saw something rising from the water, a figure, small and frail. It was a child, her hair dripping and her face pale, her arms stretched out toward me. "Help me," she said again, but her voice sounded wrong. It was too deep, like there was something else speaking with her. I stepped back, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The girl didn't move closer, but her eyes locked onto mine. They were wide and empty, like the eyes of a doll. "Why didn't you save me?" she whispered, her voice cracking. I'm trying," I stammered, but the words felt weak. Suddenly, the water surged, rising fast around me. I tried to move, but it felt like something was pulling me down. Hands cold, wet, and bony grabbed at my legs. I screamed and thrashed, but the more I fought, the stronger the grip became. The girl's face twisted into a horrible grin. "Stay with me," she said, her voice now echoing in the small room. The scratches I had seen upstairs flashed in my mind, and I realized they weren't random. They were warnings. The basement door slammed shut behind me, and the light from the window above seemed to dim. The water rose higher, up to my chest, then my neck. I gasped for air, clawing at the walls, but the hands wouldn't let go. Desperate, I grabbed at anything I could find. My hand closed around a piece of broken wood floating nearby. I swung it wildly, hitting the water where the hands were pulling me down. The grip loosened for a second, just long enough for me to scramble toward the stairs. The girl's screams filled the room, high-pitched and terrible. The water swirled violently, and I could see shadows moving beneath the surface, circling me. I climbed the stairs as fast as I could, slipping on the wet steps but refusing to stop. "Why didn't you save me?" The girl's voice boomed louder than before. I reached the top and threw myself through the door, slamming it shut behind me. The house groaned and shuddered, the walls trembling as if it was alive. The water started pouring up through the floor, chasing me as I ran. I didn't look back. I burst through the roof where I had entered, gasping for air. The rescue boat was still there, waiting. My team stared at me, confused and worried. "What happened in there?" one of them asked, but I couldn't speak. I just shook my head and collapsed onto the boat. As we moved away, I looked back at the house. The water had swallowed it completely, leaving no sign it was ever there. Later, I learned the truth about the family. They had died in the flood years ago, their bodies never found. The house was supposed to have been torn down after the disaster. But somehow, it was still there, waiting for me. I still hear the crying sometimes, in my dreams, and when I wake up, I swear I can feel the water at my feet. I've seen my share of blood and violence in this job. Broken bodies crumpled on kitchen floors, screaming families pulled apart by senseless rage, but I've never seen anything like that night. It started with the call, a routine code 10 to 71. Shots fired. My partner Jake and I didn't think twice about heading out. The dispatcher gave us the address of a house so remote that even the GPS struggled to lock onto it. As we drove, the pine trees swallowed the road, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The only sound in the cruiser was the static of the radio and the gravel crunching under the tires. A light rain started falling, the kind that made the windshield wipers groan with every sweep. We didn't talk much. There was an unspoken tension between us. It wasn't the call itself. Jake and I had answered plenty of gunfire calls before. But something about the dispatcher's voice stayed with me. She sounded uneasy, like she was holding something back. When we finally pulled up, the house stood like a corpse in the middle of the clearing. It was one of those old rural homes with sagging gutters and windows that glared like blackened eyes. The driveway was a mess of shattered glass and tire marks smeared with streaks of red. The front door hung wide open, swinging gently in the wind. Jake killed the engine. For a moment, the world felt unnaturally still, the kind of silence that makes your pulse louder than it should be. I gripped the handle of my flashlight, my fingers slick with nervous sweat. "Doesn't feel right," Jake muttered. He didn't know how right he was. The house was dead silent, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring, like the world was holding its breath. The front door creaked on its hinges as we stepped inside. The smell hit me first, metallic and thick. Blood. It clung to the air, mixing with something else, something stale and rotten. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping over overturned furniture and shattered picture frames. Bullet holes covered the walls. Some were small, others big enough to fit a fist through. Blood splatters streaked the floor, leading into different rooms like someone or something had been dragged away. "This doesn't make sense," Jake said, his voice low. "There should be..." He trailed off, but I knew what he meant. There should have been bodies. We moved through the house carefully, calling out, "Police! Anyone here?" Our voices echoed back at us, thin and empty. In the living room, the television was still on, showing static. A shattered lamp lay on the ground, its bulb flickering weakly. Every step we took felt louder than it should have been, like the house itself was listening. Then we saw it, the security room, a small setup tucked near the back of the house, with monitors still glowing. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I stepped closer. "Jake," I said, pointing at the screen, "you see that?" On one of the cameras, shadows moved across the hallway, long, dark shapes twisting and shifting. But when we looked behind us, the hallway was empty. Suspense built up. Jake leaned closer to the screen, his hand resting on the edge of the desk. The shadows on the camera weren't normal. They moved too smoothly, too fast, like they were alive. One stretched across the floor and crawled up the wall before vanishing into the ceiling. "There's no one there," Jake said, his voice shaking. "How the hell are we seeing this?" I didn't have an answer. My gut told me to leave, but we couldn't just walk out. Not yet. We heard a sound, then faint but sharp. A door creaking open somewhere in the house. Jake grabbed his radio, but all we got was static. "We need backup," I said, gripping my flashlight tighter. Jake nodded, but he didn't move. His eyes stayed glued to the screen as another shadow appeared. This one was bigger, darker. It stretched out like it was reaching for something. Then the lights in the house started flickering. The hallway outside the security room felt colder than before. My breath fogged up in front of me, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. We followed the sound of the creaking door, our footsteps echoing. It led us to the dining room. The table was knocked over, chairs smashed to pieces. Blood smeared the walls, but there was still no sign of a body. Jake was about to say something when we heard another sound, a heavy thud upstairs. We froze, listening. Another thud, louder this time. Then, faintly, the sound of footsteps. "Upstairs," Jake whispered. We moved slowly up the stairs, the wooden steps groaning under our weight. The shadows seemed to grow darker around us, like the house itself was alive. Halfway up, my flashlight flickered. I smacked it, and it came back on, but for a second, I thought I saw something. A figure standing at the top of the stairs, watching us. When I aimed my light there again, it was gone. On the second floor, the air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on us. The doors to the bedrooms were all open, but the rooms were empty except for the blood. It was everywhere. Handprints on the walls, streaks across the floors. Jake stepped into one of the rooms, his flashlight sweeping across the space. "Here is nothing here," he said. Then the door slammed shut behind him. "Jake," I shouted, yanking at the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. I could hear him pounding on the other side, his voice muffled. "It's in here," he screamed. "Something's in here with me." The lights flickered again, and I caught a glimpse of something moving down the hallway. A shadow, tall and twisted, sliding across the wall toward me. I backed up, my hand on my gun, but when I turned to look, the shadow wasn't on the wall anymore. It was on the floor, stretching toward my feet. The shadow rose up in front of me, shifting and writhing like smoke. I aimed my gun and fired, but the bullets went straight through it. Behind me, Jake's screams grew louder. The pounding stopped, and the house went silent again. The door to the bedroom creaked open slowly, but Jake wasn't there. Just his flashlight lying on the floor, its beam pointing at the wall. I stepped into the room, shaking. The shadows moved in the corners, growing thicker and darker. They seemed to be watching me, waiting. "Jake," I shouted, but my voice sounded small in the empty room. Then I felt a cold, heavy hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the shadows, closing in. The house seemed to come alive then. Doors slammed, the floor shook, and the shadows swallowed the light. I ran, but the hallway stretched out endlessly, twisting and warping. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was outside, stumbling toward the cruiser as the sun started to rise. Backup was pulling into the driveway, 3 cars, lights flashing. They found me covered in blood, my hands shaking. They searched the house, but there was no sign of Jake, no sign of anyone. The security cameras were still running, though. They showed the shadows moving through the house, growing larger, darker. One of the officers turned off the monitor, muttering about how none of it made sense. Weeks later, they called off the search for Jake. They said he was just gone, but I know the truth. He's still in there, and so are they. It was late, the kind of night where the city seemed to hold its breath, and only the ambulance siren broke the silence. I gripped the wheel tightly as we sped through the empty streets, the red lights slicing through the dark like a warning. The patient in the back was barely hanging on a middle-aged man found unconscious on the floor of a gas station restroom. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, and I could feel the weight of his life in my hands. It wasn't my first night racing against death, but tonight felt different, heavier, though I couldn't explain why. Alone in the front seat, I focused on the road, glancing occasionally at the rearview mirror to check on him. At least, I thought it was just me and him. The inside of the ambulance was cramped as always, filled with the hum and beeping of machines and the soft rattle of equipment bumping against the walls. The fluorescent ceiling light flickered every few seconds, throwing fleeting shadows across the narrow space. The air smelled of disinfectant and latex gloves, masking the underlying metallic tang of blood. Straps held the patient securely to the stretcher, or at least they should have. The city outside was a blur, headlights and streetlights rushing past the small windows. The occasional bump in the road jolted the equipment, making everything seem alive in the dim, eerie glow. Even with the siren blaring, the silence inside the ambulance felt oppressive, like something unseen was pressing down on me. It started subtly, so small that I almost missed it. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, something felt off. At first, I thought it was the flickering light playing tricks on my eyes, but then I saw it clearly. Someone was sitting in the back, next to the patient. My stomach clenched as I strained to see through the mirror. The figure was barely illuminated, but it was there, sitting unnaturally still, its head tilted slightly downward. I slammed on the brakes at a red light, my heart pounding as I turned around to look. But the back was empty, just the patient strapped to the stretcher, his face still pale and unmoving. I told myself I was imagining things, the exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. Shaking it off, I hit the gas when the light turned green, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. The heart monitor began to beep erratically, breaking the fragile calm. The man's vitals were spiking and dropping in ways I couldn't understand. I glanced at the monitor, it didn't make sense. As I adjusted the settings from the driver's seat, I caught movement in the mirror again. The figure was back, leaning over the patient. It was closer now, its face obscured in shadow, but its hands were visible, pale and thin, hovering over the man's chest like it was reaching for him. My breath caught in my throat as I spun around, this time determined to confront whoever or whatever it was. Again, the back was empty. The straps on the stretcher were tight, and the patient's eyes remained closed. I turned back to the road, but my pulse was racing, my hands slick on the steering wheel. I muttered under my breath, telling myself it was the stress, but the cold, creeping dread in my chest told me otherwise. As I drove, the whispers started, faint at first, like someone speaking just beyond the edge of hearing. It was impossible to make out the words, but the tone was unsettling, low and guttural. I turned the radio off, thinking it was interference, but the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to fill the small space, circling me, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then the ambulance shuddered, a violent jolt that nearly threw me into the steering wheel. It felt like something massive had struck the side, but when I looked out the windows, the streets were empty. I slowed down, gripping the wheel tighter, and dared to glance in the mirror again. The figure was now standing, tall and impossibly thin, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. It wasn't just watching anymore. It was moving, shifting toward the patient with an unnatural jerking gait. My voice trembled as I shouted, "Who's back there?" But I knew no one would answer. The whispers grew louder, filling my head, drowning out my thoughts. Panic took over. I floored the gas pedal, the ambulance lurching forward as the engine roared. The hospital was only a few miles away, but it felt like an eternity. The temperature inside the ambulance plummeted, my breath fogging the air as I gritted my teeth. I couldn't bring myself to look in the mirror again, but I could hear it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing in the back. The heart monitor's beeping turned to a shrill, continuous whine as the patient flatlined. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The figure was bending over the patient, its face inches from his, its features warped and shifting as though it couldn't decide what it wanted to look like. The restraints that had held the patient were torn, hanging loosely from the stretcher. The whispers turned into guttural growls, louder and louder until they felt like they were vibrating in my chest. I screamed, slamming the brakes as the hospital came into view, the ambulance skidding to a stop in front of the emergency entrance. My hands shook as I threw the ambulance into park and jumped out. I yanked open the back doors, expecting to see something terrible, but the patient was alone. He lay perfectly still, his pale face slack, his eyes wide open but unseeing. The torn straps dangled from the stretcher, and deep scratches gouged the walls of the ambulance, long and jagged, as if made by claws. Hospital staff rushed out, pulling the stretcher from the vehicle, but I stood frozen, unable to explain what had happened. I heard murmurs later as the nurses talked about the strange marks on the patient's body and the inexplicable chill inside the ambulance. Then, someone mentioned the security footage. It showed something stepping out of the back of the ambulance before I opened the doors, a shadowy figure, tall and thin, disappearing into the night without a trace. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real. that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something unnatural had been in that ambulance, and I had brought it with me.